The border of human space was quiet that morning. Quiet in the way that space is always quiet, with no sound at all, only the slow turning of stars and the soft hum of ship engines. But everyone on the bridge of the UES Resolute knew that quiet did not mean safe. Quiet often meant something big was about to happen. Admiral Sarah Chen stood at the center of the bridge with her arms folded behind her back. She was a tall woman with short black hair and calm brown eyes. She had been in the fleet for 22 years, and in that time she had learned one important lesson. The universe did not care about human plans. It only cared about what actually happened. "Report," she said, not turning around. Lieutenant Commander David Kim answered from the tactical station. "Admiral, long-range sensors are picking up a large fleet entering the Kepler border system. Judging by the energy signatures, it's Threxian ships, a lot of them." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but her face did not change. "How many is a lot?" "At least 200 vessels, ma'am. Maybe more. The lead ship alone is massive, bigger than anything we've seen from them before." The bridge went silent. Commander Marcus Reyes, the ship's second-in-command, walked over to stand beside Sarah. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a habit of chewing gum when he was nervous. He was chewing gum now. 200 ships, Marcus said quietly. "That's not a patrol. That's an invasion force." "Or it's a message," Sarah said. "The Threxians love sending messages." To understand why Sarah said this, you must first understand who the Threxian Dominion was. The Threxian Dominion was one of the oldest and largest empires in the known galaxy. They had existed for over 4,000 years, and in that time they had conquered more than 300 alien worlds. They did not conquer worlds only with weapons. They conquered worlds with fear. This was their true weapon, sharper than any laser and stronger than any shield. The Threxians believed that fear was the most powerful force in the universe. A frightened enemy made mistakes. A frightened enemy surrendered before the first shot was fired. A frightened enemy sometimes destroyed itself out of panic, saving the Dominion the trouble of fighting at all. So the Threxians had spent centuries perfecting the art of terror. Their ships were built to look horrifying, with sharp black hulls shaped like blades and skulls. Their war horns played sounds designed to trigger fear responses in almost every known species. Their commanders gave long speeches before battle, speeches meant to break the spirit of their enemies before a single shot was exchanged. It had worked on the Grellan Hive. It had worked on the Voss Collective. It had worked on the Ythar Kingdoms, who surrendered 11 planets without firing a single shot, simply because the sight of the Threxian fleet arriving in the sky was too much for them to bear. It had never been tried on humans. Not like this, not with a fleet this large. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Priya Nair from the communication station. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice that never shook, even now. "I'm receiving a transmission request from the lead Threxian ship. They want to open a channel." Sarah looked at Marcus. Marcus shrugged. "Might as well hear what they have to say." "Put it on the main screen," Sarah said. The screen flickered and changed. On it appeared the image of a Threxian officer. He was tall, taller than any human, with gray skin that looked like stone, and eyes that glowed a faint red. He wore black armor covered in small spikes, and behind him stood dozens of other Threxian soldiers, all standing perfectly still like statues. "This is Sub-Commander Threll, of the Threxian Dominion," the alien said. His voice was deep and echoed strangely, as if it had been altered to sound more frightening. "You are trespassing in a system claimed by the Dominion. Grand Admiral Voss Kethrani commands you to power down your weapons and prepare to receive your judgment." Sarah stepped forward so she was fully in view of the camera. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Sol Defense Fleet, representing the United Earth Systems. This system is not claimed territory. It sits in neutral space, confirmed by 3 separate galactic surveys. We are not trespassing anywhere." Sub-Commander Threll's red eyes narrowed slightly. "You will not survive a confrontation with the Dominion fleet. Grand Admiral Kethrani offers you a chance to save your people from destruction. Surrender now, and you will be spared." "We appreciate the offer," Sarah said, her voice calm and even. "But we're going to have to decline." There was a pause. Threll looked almost confused, as if he had expected a different answer. "You do not understand," he said slowly. The Grand Admiral does not make this offer twice. In 3 hours, our fleet will demonstrate why every species in this quadrant fears the name Threxian. You would be wise to reconsider. The transmission cut off. The bridge was silent for a moment. Then Marcus let out a low whistle. Well, that was dramatic. They do love their dramatic speeches, said Lieutenant Nair, shaking her head. My grandmother used to say the Threxians could win an award for overacting if the galaxy ever had an award show for that sort of thing. A few people on the bridge chuckled, but Sarah did not laugh. She was thinking hard. David, she said, pull up everything we have on Threxian tactics. Every recorded engagement, every historical account, everything. Already on it, Admiral, Kim said, his fingers moving fast across his console. While the tactical officer worked, Sarah walked to the observation window at the side of the bridge. Outside, the stars stretched out in every direction, calm and endless. Somewhere out there, 200 Threxian warships were moving closer, preparing to try something that had worked on hundreds of other species before. Sarah did not know exactly what the Threxians were planning, but she had read enough history to have a guess. And if her guess was right, this was going to be a very strange day. 3 hours is a long time to wait for an enemy fleet to arrive. Some crew members spent it checking and rechecking their stations. Some spent it writing messages home, just in case. But many of them spent it doing something that might surprise people who had never served on a human warship before. They spent it laughing and talking with each other, almost as if nothing serious was happening at all. In the mess hall, a group of engineers sat around a table eating sandwiches and watching old video clips on a tablet. One of them, a young woman named Isabella Ruiz, was showing her friends a very old movie clip from Earth history, something called a monster movie, from over 100 years ago. The monster in the movie was clearly a man in a rubber suit, and every time it appeared on screen, the group burst into laughter. This is what I imagine the Threxians look like when they're trying to be scary, Isabella said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Her friend, a mechanic named Tomas Silva, shook his head. Nah, I've seen pictures. They actually look pretty intimidating. Big gray guys, spikes everywhere, red eyes. It's the whole act around it that's funny. All that talking about doom and judgment. Sounds like every cheesy villain from every old movie ever made. You know what's wild, said another engineer. A man named Chen Wei, no relation to the Admiral. Humans have literally been telling stories about scary monsters and evil empires for thousands of years. Books, movies, games, all of it. We've basically trained ourselves to recognize this exact kind of thing. It's like cultural muscle memory. Isabella nodded slowly. So when a real alien empire shows up and does the exact same thing our fiction has been doing for centuries, it just looks like a bad movie, Tomas finished. A really, really bad movie. They all laughed again, though there was a nervous edge to it now, because as funny as it seemed, they all knew that somewhere outside the ship, 200 very real warships filled with very real weapons were getting closer every minute. On the bridge, Sarah reviewed the historical files that David Kim had pulled up. She read about the fall of the Ethar kingdoms, how a Threxian fleet had arrived above their capital world and performed something called the Rite of Ending, a long ceremony involving lights, sounds, and a speech from the Threxian commander that lasted almost an hour. According to the records, the Ethar surrendered before the speech even finished. She read about the Grellan hive, an insect-like species who had fought bravely against many enemies but collapsed completely when faced with Threxian psychological tactics. The hive's own historical records described the Threxian display as an assault upon the mind itself. She read about a dozen other species, each with similar stories. Fleets that froze, commanders who surrendered without firing a shot, entire civilizations that gave up simply because the Threxians had shown up and acted terrifying enough. It's always the same pattern, Sarah muttered to herself. Ma'am, said David, looking up from his console. Every single time, Sarah said, tapping the screen in front of her. They use fear as the main weapon before they use actual weapons. Big ships, scary sounds, long speeches, dramatic lighting. It's almost theatrical. Marcus leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. Theatrical is one word for it, he said, but it clearly works. 300 conquered worlds is nothing to laugh at. Sarah looked up at him. Isn't it though? Marcus blinked. What do you mean? Think about what you just said. Theatrical, Sarah said. Marcus, humans have been telling stories, acting in plays, making movies, and writing books for thousands of years. We have an entire section of our culture built around villains who talk too much, monsters who try to look scary, and evil empires who give big speeches before battle. We've seen this story 1,000 times before we ever left our own planet. Understanding began to dawn on Marcus's face. You think the crew won't be scared? I think, Sarah said slowly, that the crew is going to see something they've watched in movies since they were children, and I think that's going to feel very different to us than it does to species who have never told stories like that before. Marcus rubbed his chin. That's a big risk, Admiral. If you're wrong, and this really does terrify people. I know, Sarah said, but if I'm right, we might have found something the Threxians never expected, a weakness in their favorite weapon. She turned back to the main screen, where the edge of the Threxian fleet had just become visible on long-range sensors, a dark cluster of ships moving steadily closer. Send word to all departments, Sarah said. Everyone stays at battle stations. Everyone stays professional. But if something strange happens up here, and if people start reacting in ways we don't expect, let it happen. Don't punish it. Just watch, and be ready. Aye, Admiral, said Lieutenant Nair, already sending the message. 2 hours later, the Threxian fleet arrived in full view. It was, Sarah had to admit, an impressive sight. 200 ships spread out across the dark sky, their black hulls catching what little starlight there was. At the front of the formation was the largest ship Sarah had ever seen, a vessel so massive it seemed to swallow the stars behind it. Its hull was shaped like a great blade, curving upward at the front into something that looked almost like a crown of thorns. That's the voice of extinction, David Kim said, his voice quiet, with something between fear and awe. Grand Admiral Kathrani's flagship. I've read about it, never seen it in person. It's big, Marcus admitted. I'll give them that. Sarah studied the ship carefully. It was designed, she realized, exactly like something out of an old fantasy story. Sharp edges, dark colors, a shape meant to look like a weapon, a crown, and a monster all at once. They really do commit to the aesthetic, she murmured. Behind her, she heard a few quiet chuckles from the crew, quickly stifled. She didn't turn around to scold them. She simply kept watching. A new transmission request appeared on the comm system. This time it was not Sub-Commander Threll. It was someone else. Someone whose image filled the entire main screen, larger and more detailed than before. Grand Admiral Vos Kathrani was even taller than Threll, with skin so dark gray it was almost black, and eyes that burned a deep, unsettling red. His armor was covered in small trophies, pieces of metal and bone from dozens of different species, each one representing a world he had helped conquer. When he spoke, his voice rumbled through the ship's speakers like distant thunder. Humans, Kathrani said, drawing the word out slowly, as if tasting it. I am told your species is young, foolish, unaware of what true power looks like. Sarah stood tall in front of the camera, her hands clasped behind her back. Grand Admiral Kathrani, we've read about your dominion, very impressive conquest record. Then you understand what is about to happen, Kathrani said. In every case, in every world we have visited, the outcome has been the same. Fear breaks the will of lesser species before a single shot is fired. Today, you will learn why. I look forward to it, Sarah said pleasantly. Kathrani's red eyes narrowed slightly, as if her calm tone puzzled him. You mock me. Not at all, Grand Admiral, Sarah said. I'm simply curious to see what you have planned. There was a pause, then Kathrani's face twisted into something that might have been meant as a smile, though on his gray stone-like features it looked more like a crack forming in rock. Very well, he said. Then watch closely, Admiral Chen. Watch, and remember this moment as the last time your species felt safe. The transmission ended. Sarah turned to look at her crew. Every station was manned. Every officer was watching the main screen, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy. But underneath it, she thought she could also feel something else, a kind of readiness, a kind of calm. "All hands," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the bridge. "Whatever happens next, remember who we are. Stay focused, stay professional." She paused, and a small, knowing smile crossed her face. "And if you feel like laughing," she added, "don't hold it in too hard." A ripple of confused looks passed across the bridge. Marcus raised an eyebrow at her, but before anyone could ask what she meant, the entire Threxian fleet began to move. 200 ships shifted in perfect, eerie unison, sliding into a new formation. Lights along their hulls began to glow a deep, blood red, and from somewhere deep within the voice of extinction, a low, terrible sound began to build, a war horn unlike anything human ears had ever heard, designed over thousands of years to strike fear into the hearts of every living creature who heard it. The Threxian Dominion was about to begin its most powerful weapon. And on the bridge of the UES Resolute, humanity waited to see exactly how it would land. The sound rolled across space like a living thing. It was not really a sound that traveled through vacuum, of course. Space carries no sound on its own. But the Threxian engineers had solved that problem centuries ago. Every ship in their fleet was equipped with special resonance emitters that pushed sound waves directly into the hulls of nearby enemy ships, making the enemy's own metal walls vibrate and hum with the terrible noise. It was a clever piece of engineering, built entirely for one purpose: to make fear feel inescapable, even through the empty void of space. On the bridge of the UES Resolute, the deck plates began to hum, then the walls, then, slowly, the air itself seemed to fill with a deep, groaning tone that rose and fell like a great creature breathing. That's actually getting into my chest," Marcus said, one hand pressed against his sternum. "It's a resonance frequency," David Kim said, watching his monitors carefully. "Designed to match certain patterns in humanoid nervous systems. It's meant to trigger a fear response automatically, without us even having to think about it." "Is it working?" Sarah asked. David checked his readings. Heart rates across the ship are up slightly, some elevated stress markers. But, he paused, frowning at his screen. But nothing close to what the historical records describe for other species. The Ethar reports mention heart rates tripling. Ours are barely up 10%. Sarah nodded slowly, filing that information away. "Keep watching." Outside the ship, the Threxian fleet continued its display. The 200 warships had arranged themselves into a massive shape, one that became clearer the longer Sarah watched. It was a skull, a giant skull made of warships, its hollow eyes formed by clusters of ships with their weapons glowing a dark red, its jagged teeth formed by smaller vessels, arranged in a jagged row along the bottom. "They built a skull," Isabella Ruiz said from the engineering deck below, watching the same view on a secondary screen. Tomas Silva stood beside her, arms crossed, staring at the formation with wide eyes. "They built a 200-ship skull," he repeated, "in space, using actual warships. That must have taken forever to plan." "It's actually kind of impressive," Isabella admitted, in a completely ridiculous way. Back on the bridge, the low horn sound continued to build, and now a new element joined it. Lights began to flash across the Threxian formation, timed perfectly with the horn, creating a rhythm that pulsed through the humming hull of the Resolute, like a heartbeat. Then, on the main screen, a new image appeared. It was Grand Admiral Kethrani again, but this time he stood on a raised platform, surrounded by his officers, all of them standing in perfectly straight rows behind him. Bright red light poured down from somewhere above him, casting long shadows across his stone-gray face. "Humans," Kethrani began, his voice booming through the ship's speakers, deeper now, more resonant, clearly enhanced by some kind of audio processing. "Behold the voice of extinction. Behold the Dominion's judgment." Behind him, holographic images began to flicker into existence, floating above the platform like ghosts. They showed scenes from past Threxian conquests, burning cities, fleeing crowds, alien creatures kneeling before Threxian soldiers. Each image lasted only a few seconds before shifting to the next, one after another, a parade of destruction meant to demonstrate the Dominion's power. "For 4,000 years, Kethrani continued, no species has stood against the Dominion and survived unchanged. Some bent the knee, Some were erased entirely. The choice, humans, is entirely yours to make. But know this. He raised one clawed hand slowly, dramatically, as the horn sound reached its loudest point. There is no future, Kethrani said, in which you defy us and remain unbroken. The horn sound cut off suddenly, leaving a ringing silence in its place. The holographic images faded. Kethrani stood perfectly still, staring directly into the camera, waiting. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge of the Resolute said anything at all. Then, from somewhere near the back of the bridge, a young ensign named Robert Alvarez let out a small, strangled sound. He clapped a hand over his mouth immediately, his eyes wide with embarrassment, but it was too late. The sound had already escaped. It was unmistakably a laugh. Sarah did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, on Kethrani's proud, waiting face, and felt her own mouth twitch at the corners. Admiral Chen, Kethrani said, his voice sharp now, you will respond. Sarah took a slow breath, trying to keep her voice steady. Grand Admiral Kethrani, that was... She paused, choosing her words carefully. That was quite a presentation. It is the truth, Kethrani said. The truth of what awaits those who defy the Dominion. Right, Sarah said. The skull formation, the dramatic lighting, the slow hand raise at the end. I have to ask, Grand Admiral, did you rehearse that speech? Kethrani's red eyes flickered with something that might have been confusion. Rehearse? You know, Sarah said, practice it. Say it a few times in front of a mirror. Work on the timing. There was a pause. Marcus, standing beside Sarah, had gone very still, his jaw clenched tight as he fought to keep a straight face. Behind them, Ensign Alvarez was pressing both hands over his mouth now, his shoulders shaking. I do not understand your question, Kethrani said slowly. It's just, Sarah continued, that speech was very well put together. The pacing, the dramatic pause before the last line, the way you raised your hand right as the horn stopped. That takes practice, Grand Admiral. I'm impressed. For the first time since the transmission began, Grand Admiral Kethrani looked genuinely uncertain. His officers behind him exchanged confused glances, their red eyes darting between each other and their commander. This is not a matter for jokes, Kethrani said, his voice rising slightly. I have shown you the fate of 300 worlds. I have shown you the truth of Threxian power. I know, Sarah said. I saw. It's just, Grand Admiral, has anyone ever told you that this whole display looks exactly like something out of an old movie? A what? A movie, Sarah said. It's a form of entertainment we have back on Earth. Stories acted out, usually with a villain who talks a lot before doing anything. The evil emperor character always does the big dramatic speech, the slow hand gesture, the flashing red lights. You've basically performed one of the most common scenes in human fiction, word for word, almost. Behind Sarah, someone else lost the battle against laughter. Then another, then another. Within seconds, laughter was rippling across the bridge of the Resolute, quiet at first, then growing louder, spreading from station to station like a wave. Sarah felt her own controls slipping, a smile breaking across her face despite her best efforts to stay serious. On the screen, Grand Admiral Kethrani stared out at the laughing humans with an expression none of his officers had ever seen on him before. Confusion. Genuine, deep confusion. You are laughing, he said slowly, as if testing the words. You are laughing at the right of judgment. I'm sorry, Grand Admiral, Sarah managed, though she wasn't laughing herself. Not yet, not quite. It's very familiar. Very, very familiar. Behind Kethrani, Sub-Commander Threll leaned close and whispered something urgently into his ear. Kethrani's red eyes widened slightly, and his gray face, already dark, seemed to darken further. Cut the transmission, Kethrani snapped. The screen went black. For a moment, the bridge of the Resolute was frozen, everyone staring at the dark screen where the Grand Admiral's face had been. Then Ensign Alvarez, unable to hold it in any longer, let out a full, loud laugh, and the entire bridge erupted. Marcus doubled over, one hand braced against a console, laughing so hard tears formed in his eyes. Lieutenant Nair was shaking her head, grinning widely, muttering something about how she couldn't believe she had just watched that happen in real life. Even David Kim, usually so serious at his tactical station, was chuckling as he continued to monitor the Threxian fleet. Sarah allowed herself a small laugh too, though she quickly reined it back in, raising a hand to call for quiet. All right, she said, though there was warmth in her voice. Settle down, everyone. This isn't over yet. The laughter died down slowly, replaced by a strange kind of energy on the bridge, a mixture of relief and disbelief, and something like excitement. Admiral, David said, still smiling slightly. Sensors show unusual activity across the Threxian fleet. Their formation is breaking apart. It looks like they're regrouping, reorganizing. They didn't expect that, Marcus said, wiping his eyes. Sarah, they genuinely didn't expect us to laugh. No, Sarah agreed, watching the Threxian ships shift and scatter on her screen, their perfect skull formation dissolving into confused clusters. I don't think they did. Aboard the Voice of Extinction, the mood was very different. Grand Admiral Vos Kethrani stood in the center of his command deck, his claws digging into the armrests of his command throne so hard that small cracks appeared in the metal. Around him, his officers stood in tense silence, none of them daring to speak first. Explain, Kethrani said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. Explain to me what I just witnessed. Sub-Commander Threll stepped forward carefully. Grand Admiral, the humans, they responded to the right of judgment with laughter. I know what happened, Threll, Kethrani snapped. I am asking you to explain why, in 4,000 years, the right has never failed. Not once. Every species who has witnessed it has responded with fear, submission, or panic, never with laughter. Threll hesitated. Grand Admiral, the Sensor Division has been reviewing human cultural data since the transmission ended. It appears that human civilization has an extremely long history of storytelling, involving similar imagery. Similar imagery, Kethrani repeated. Villains who give long speeches, Threll continued, reading nervously from a datapad. Dramatic gestures, ominous lighting, threatening music. It seems these elements are extremely common across human fiction, going back thousands of years, across nearly every human culture and nation. The humans call this pattern a cliché. A cliché, Kethrani said flatly. A predictable and overused pattern, Threll explained. One that no longer carries the emotional weight it once did, because the audience has seen it too many times before. Kethrani sat back in his command throne, his red eyes narrowing as he processed this information. Around the command deck, his officers shifted uncomfortably, waiting to see how their Grand Admiral would react to this humiliation. 4,000 years, Kethrani said slowly, of perfecting the right of judgment. 4,000 years of watching entire civilizations crumble at the sight of it, and this species finds it predictable. Grand Admiral, another officer spoke up carefully, a science division commander named Yersil. If I may, the human species is very young by galactic standards. Their entire civilization spans only a few thousand years. And yet in that time, they appear to have produced an enormous volume of fictional entertainment, exploring themes of conflict, villainy, and conquest. It is possible that no species we have encountered has ever had this particular cultural immunity. Kethrani was silent for a long moment, staring at the dark screen where the human admiral's laughing face had been only minutes before. Cultural immunity, he repeated softly. Grand Admiral, Threll said, his voice careful. Shall we proceed with the standard escalation? Weapons demonstration, perhaps, or the... No, Kethrani said sharply, cutting him off. No. The right of judgment is not simply a tool, Threll. It is a symbol of the Dominion's authority. If word spreads across the quadrant that the right failed, that it was mocked, laughed at by a species barely out of its own solar system, it will not matter how many ships we bring to this battle. He rose slowly from his throne, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the command deck. Every species watching this system right now, every observer ship, every spy, every neutral party gathering intelligence, they will all know within hours that the humans laughed at the right of judgment. And laughter, Threll, spreads faster than fear ever could. The command deck was silent, every officer understanding the weight of what their Grand Admiral was saying. The Threxian Dominion had built its entire reputation, its entire method of conquest, on the idea that resistance was pointless, because fear made resistance impossible. If that foundation cracked, even slightly, the entire structure of their power could begin to crumble. "What are your orders, Grand Admiral?" Threll asked quietly. Kathrani stared at the black screen for a long moment before answering. "Prepare a new approach," he said finally. "If theatrics will not work on this species, then we will show them something they cannot laugh at. We will show them true power." He turned to face his assembled officers, his red eyes burning with something between anger and grim determination. "No more speeches," Kathrani said. "No more rituals. This time, we show them exactly what our weapons can do." Far across the dark space between the two fleets, on the bridge of the UES Resolute, Admiral Sarah Chen watched the Threxian formation continue to shift and reorganize, and felt the last traces of laughter fade from her chest, replaced by a familiar, focused calm. "David," she said quietly, "what are they doing now?" "Hard to say, Admiral," David Kim replied, watching his sensors carefully. "But whatever it is, I don't think it's going to be funny this time." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the massive dark shape of the Voice of Extinction, still looming at the front of the Threxian fleet. "Then we'd better be ready for anything," she said, "because I have a feeling this is only the beginning. Word travels fast in space, even faster than ships can fly. This is because most advanced civilizations do not rely only on physical travel to share information. They use relay networks, hidden listening posts, and observer drones scattered quietly across the galaxy, watching, recording, and sending data back to their home governments at the speed of light. The Kepler border system, it turned out, was being watched by more than just the humans and the Threxians. Hidden at the edge of the system, cloaked and silent, sat 3 small observer vessels belonging to the Ethar kingdoms, the very species who had surrendered to the Threxians without firing a single shot, generations ago. They had come to watch, quietly and carefully, curious to see how this new species called humanity would respond to the same fear tactics that had once broken their own ancestors. Further out, closer to the edge of the system, a single scout ship from the Coalition of Free Worlds sat recording everything, its long-range sensors capturing every detail of the confrontation to send back to Coalition Command. And somewhere among the drifting asteroids near the system's edge, a small, heavily disguised vessel belonging to an information broker named Zix Halvorn watched with great interest, already composing the message he planned to sell to a dozen different governments the moment this encounter was over. None of them expected what they were about to witness. Aboard the Voice of Extinction, Grand Admiral Kathrani stood at the center of his command deck, watching a holographic display of the Threxian fleet reorganizing itself. Gone was the dramatic skull formation. In its place, the 200 ships arranged themselves into a simple, efficient battle line, weapons charging, shields raising. "Sub-Commander Threll," Kathrani said, "status of the weapons array." "Charging now, Grand Admiral," Threll replied. "The primary cannon on the Voice of Extinction will be ready to fire within 4 minutes." Kathrani nodded slowly. The primary cannon was not a weapon meant to destroy the human fleet, not yet. It was meant to be fired into empty space, close enough to the human ships that they would feel its power without being harmed by it. A demonstration, a warning shot on a scale large enough to shake the confidence of any species, no matter how strange their sense of humor might be. "Target coordinates set," said the weapons officer, a Threxian named Drow. "Firing solution locked on a point 400 kilometers from the human flagship." "Good," Kathrani said. "Let them laugh at that." On the bridge of the Resolute, tension had returned in full force. The laughter from earlier had faded completely, replaced by focused, quiet readiness. Every station was manned. Every officer watched their screens carefully. "Admiral," David Kim said, "I'm reading a massive energy buildup from the Threxian flagship. Some kind of main weapon, charging fast." "Distance to target?" Sarah asked. "Unknown yet. But if that thing fires anywhere close to us, our shields are going to feel it," David said. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Raise shields to full power. All hands. Brace for possible impact." "Aye, Admiral," came the response from around the bridge, voices sharp and focused now. Marcus stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his voice. You think they're actually going to fire on us? I think, Sarah said slowly, that they're going to fire near us, close enough to scare us. That's how this works, Marcus. Big show of force. Then the actual violence starts, only if the fear doesn't work. And if the fear doesn't work this time either? Sarah looked at him, her expression grim. Then we find out how serious they really are. 4 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, without any further warning, without any speech or dramatic countdown, the primary cannon of the voice of extinction fired. A beam of pure white energy tore across the darkness of space, so bright it lit up the hulls of every nearby ship like a second sun. It struck empty space exactly 400 kilometers from the Resolute, and the resulting explosion was silent in the vacuum, but visually enormous. A blinding flash that expanded into a slowly fading cloud of white energy. The shockwave reached the Resolute seconds later, a wave of gravitational disturbance that shook the ship hard enough to rattle every console on the bridge. Alarms blared briefly before automatic systems compensated and silenced them. Shields held at 81%, David reported, his voice steady despite the shaking. No damage to hull integrity. Sarah gripped the edge of her command chair, waiting for her own heart rate to settle. Around her, the bridge crew recovered quickly, checking their stations, confirming systems were still functioning. The screen flickered, and Grand Admiral Kethrani's face appeared once more, this time without any dramatic lighting or slow camera movements, just his stone-gray face, staring directly into the camera. That, Kethrani said, was a warning shot. The next one will not miss. Sarah straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze evenly. That's quite a weapon, Grand Admiral. It is the smallest weapon on this ship, Kethrani said. Do you understand now? This is not theater. This is not a story you have seen before. This is real power, and it will end your fleet in moments, if you continue to resist. Sarah studied his face carefully. There was something different in his tone now, something more controlled, more careful. He had learned from the last encounter. He was no longer giving her room to mock him. I understand it's real, Grand Admiral, Sarah said carefully. I'm not questioning that your weapons are powerful. I saw the shot. It was impressive. Then you understand your only reasonable choice, Kethrani said. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her next words carefully. Behind her, she could feel the crew watching, waiting to see how she would respond. Grand Admiral, she said finally, can I ask you something? Kethrani's red eyes narrowed slightly. What? Why did you fire at 400 kilometers away? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What kind of question is that? I'm curious, Sarah said. If you wanted to actually scare us, wouldn't it have made more sense to fire closer? Or is 400 kilometers your fleet's version of a safe distance? Some kind of regulation, maybe, to avoid actually hitting the target by accident. There was a pause. Sarah could see, even through the low resolution of the transmission, a flicker of uncertainty cross Kethrani's stony features. The distance was calculated precisely, Kethrani said, his voice slightly less steady than before, to demonstrate power without unnecessary destruction. Right, Sarah said, nodding slowly. It's just, where I come from, when someone really wants to scare you, they usually don't give you a nice, safe, calculated warning shot. They just do the thing. The fact that you calculated a safe distance kind of makes it feel like, she paused, tilting her head slightly, like you're not actually sure you want a real fight either. The bridge of the Resolute went very quiet, everyone watching the screen intently. Kethrani's gray face seemed to darken further, a deep flush of something like anger crossing his features. You dare to suggest the Dominion fears combat? I didn't say fear, Sarah said calmly. I said calculated. There's a difference. Fear is what you're trying to make us feel. Calculation is what I'm seeing you actually do. You've fired one very impressive, very safe warning shot, and now you're back on the screen giving me another speech instead of just attacking. If you really wanted to destroy us, Grand Admiral, I don't think we'd still be having this conversation. For a long, tense moment, Kethrani said nothing at all. His officers behind him exchanged nervous glances, none of them daring to speak. Then, from somewhere near the back of the Resolute's bridge, a quiet voice broke the silence. It was Ensign Alvarez again, the same young officer who had laughed first during the earlier encounter. This time his voice was hushed, meant only for the people near him, but in the tense quiet of the bridge, it carried further than he intended. "She's basically calling him a chicken," Alvarez whispered to the officer next to him. A muffled snort of laughter escaped from somewhere near the science station. Then another. Sarah, still facing the screen, felt her own lips twitch upward slightly despite her best effort to remain composed. On the screen, Kethrani's translator picked up the whispered comment, processing it and delivering a rough translation directly to him. His red eyes widened. "A what?" he demanded. "What is a chicken?" Marcus, standing beside Sarah, made a strangled sound as he tried to hold back his own laughter. "Admiral," he whispered, "should someone explain?" "I think," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "that might make things worse, actually." But it was too late. Somewhere in the depths of the Voice of Extinction's translation systems, a definition had already been found and delivered to Grand Admiral Kethrani's earpiece. A small, flightless bird, commonly associated on Earth with cowardice, due to its tendency to flee from danger rather than fight. Kethrani's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, and finally, a deep, burning anger. "You compare the Grand Admiral of the Threxian Dominion," he said, his voice rising with each word, "to a small, flightless prey animal?" And that, more than anything that had happened before, was the moment the entire bridge of the Resolute lost control completely. The laughter that broke out was not quiet this time. It was loud, full, uncontrollable laughter, the kind that comes from deep in the chest and cannot be stopped no matter how hard someone tries. Marcus doubled over completely, both hands braced on his knees. Lieutenant Nair had to turn away from her console entirely, shoulders shaking. Even David Kim, still trying to monitor sensors through his own laughter, was wiping tears from his eyes. Sarah herself, despite every ounce of professional training telling her to maintain composure in front of an enemy commander, felt the laughter bubble up from somewhere she couldn't control, and within seconds she was laughing too, one hand pressed against her mouth, trying and failing to hold it back. On the screen, Grand Admiral Vos Kethrani stood frozen, watching an entire human bridge crew, including their commanding officer, dissolve into helpless laughter at the mere suggestion that he might be compared to a small bird. Behind him, his own officers stood in stunned silence, watching their Grand Admiral's reaction with growing alarm. None of them had ever seen him look quite like this before. Not angry exactly. Something closer to bewildered, something closer to lost. "This," Kethrani said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "is not over." The transmission cut off abruptly. Slowly, gradually, the laughter on the Resolute's bridge began to die down, replaced by exhausted grins and quiet chuckles. Sarah wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady herself, forcing her expression back into something more appropriately serious. "All right," she said, her voice still slightly unsteady. "All right, everyone, that's enough. Back to stations." But even as she said it, she could see the change that had come over her crew. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface since the Threxian fleet first arrived. That fear had faded, replaced by something else entirely, something that looked a lot like confidence. "David," Sarah said, "what's the Threxian fleet doing now?" David checked his screen, still smiling slightly despite himself. "Regrouping again, Admiral. And, interesting. What is it? Looks like some of their ships are pulling back slightly. Not retreating exactly, but repositioning. It's like they're not sure what to do next." Sarah nodded slowly, watching the Threxian formation shift uncertainly on her screen. "They've spent 4,000 years perfecting how to make enemies afraid," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "I don't think they ever prepared for an enemy who'd laugh instead." Far out at the edge of the system, aboard the small Ythar observer vessel, an elderly Ythar commander named Vesik Tho watched the entire exchange with wide, unblinking eyes. Beside him, his young second officer stared at the same screen in silent disbelief. "Commander," the young officer said finally, "did the humans just mock the Grand Admiral to his face?" during an active military confrontation. Vesic Tho did not answer immediately. He sat very still, replaying the exchange in his mind, remembering his own people's history, the day the Threxian fleet had arrived above the Ethar homeworld, the same dramatic display, the same terrible fear that had spread through every Ethar heart and mind, until surrender seemed like the only possible choice. Yes, Vesic Tho said finally, his voice quiet with something between disbelief and dawning hope. Yes, they did. Is that wise? Vesic Tho was silent for a long moment, watching the Threxian fleet continue to shift and reposition uncertainly on his screen. I do not know if it is wise, he said slowly, but I have watched the right of judgment break the will of a dozen different species in my lifetime. I have never, not once, seen it fail before today. He turned to his young officer, his old eyes bright with something that had not been there in a very long time. Send this recording to Uthar Command immediately, he said. Every ship, every colony, every corner of our territory needs to see this. The Dominion is not invincible. It never was. We simply never had the chance to see it. As the recording began transmitting outward across the galaxy, carried by relay stations and hidden listening posts, word of what had happened at the Kepler border began to spread, faster than any fleet could travel, faster than any empire could control. And aboard the Voice of Extinction, Grand Admiral Vos Kethrani stood alone in his private quarters, staring at a paused image of Admiral Sarah Chen's laughing face, and felt something he had not felt in over 300 years of service to the Dominion. He felt, for the very first time, something close to real fear. News does not travel through space the way it once did on old Earth, passed slowly from town to town by riders and messengers. In the galaxy, news travels through relay networks, bouncing from station to station at the speed of light, reaching 1,000 worlds within hours. And the news from the Kepler border system was the kind that no relay network could hold back. Within 6 hours of the encounter, the recording made by the Ethar observer ship had reached every major Ethar colony. Within 12 hours, it had reached the coalition of free worlds, passed along by their own scout ship, which had recorded the same events from a different angle. Within a full day, it had reached dozens of smaller species scattered across the quadrant. Species who had lived for generations under the shadow of Threxian power. Species who had heard stories of the right of judgment, but had never seen it fail. And everywhere the recording spread, the reaction was the same. Disbelief, followed by something that could only be described as hope. Aboard the Voice of Extinction, Grand Admiral Vos Kethrani stood in a private communications chamber, waiting for a transmission he had been dreading since the moment his humiliation had first spread across the ship. The screen in front of him flickered, and the image of a much older Threxian appeared, a figure with pale gray skin and deep lines carved into his face by centuries of command. This was High Overlord Draxus Vel, ruler of the entire Threxian Dominion, and the being to whom Kethrani ultimately answered. Grand Admiral, High Overlord Vel said, his voice cold and measured, I have watched the recording 3 times now. I confess I still do not fully understand what I am seeing. Kethrani lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect mixed with shame. High Overlord, I take full responsibility for. I am not interested in your apologies, Vel interrupted sharply. I am interested in understanding what happened. You performed the rite of judgment, a ritual that has succeeded in every recorded instance for 4,000 years. And the humans laughed at you. Yes, High Overlord. Not once, Vel continued, but repeatedly. Even after a demonstration of the primary canon, even in the face of certain destruction, this species found humor in our display of power. Kethrani took a slow breath. High Overlord, my science officer has developed a theory. It appears that human civilization has an unusually long history of storytelling involving themes very similar to the rite. Villains, dramatic speeches, displays of overwhelming force. The humans have apparently consumed so much fictional entertainment built around these exact patterns that our genuine display registered to them as familiar, even predictable. Vel was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes narrowing as he considered this information. You are telling me, he said slowly, that this species is immune to fear tactics, because they have spent generations pretending to experience those exact same tactics for entertainment. That is the working theory, High Overlord. Vel leaned back, his expression unreadable. In 4,000 years, Grand Admiral, we have never encountered a weakness in the right of judgment. We built our entire early expansion policy around it. Dozens of worlds surrendered without meaningful resistance because the right broke their will before battle ever began. If this weapon no longer functions, he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Every Threxian officer understood the implication. The Dominion's reputation, the very foundation of their power across hundreds of worlds, rested heavily on the fear their name inspired. If that fear could be broken, if other species began to realize that the terrifying Threxian rituals were nothing more than theater to be laughed at, the entire structure of their empire could begin to crumble. "What are your orders, High Overlord?" Kethrani asked quietly. Vel considered this for a long moment. "You will not withdraw," he said finally. "A retreat now, after this humiliation, would only confirm to every watching species that the Dominion can be mocked and survive unpunished. That cannot be allowed to happen." "Then we proceed to direct combat?" Kethrani asked. "No," Vel said sharply. "Not yet. A human fleet of that size destroyed in open battle would prove nothing except that we possess superior weapons, which every species already assumes. It would not restore what was lost today. We need something else." "What would you suggest, High Overlord?" Vel's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You will offer them a formal challenge. A single ship duel, commander against commander, witnessed by all observing parties. If the humans truly do not fear us, let their admiral prove it directly, face to face, without the safety of numbers behind her. If she wins, unlikely as that may be, we will withdraw with our reputation intact, having tested a worthy opponent honestly. If she loses, or refuses, the lesson will be clear to every species watching. Human bravado is nothing more than that, bravado without substance behind it." Kethrani considered this carefully. "And if she accepts, and somehow wins?" Vel's expression darkened. "Then, Grand Admiral, we will have far bigger problems than a damaged reputation, but I suspect that possibility is smaller than you fear." Back aboard the Resolute, the mood had shifted into something focused and purposeful. Sarah stood in the small conference room just off the main bridge, along with Marcus, David Kim, and Lieutenant Nair, reviewing the sensor data from the earlier encounter. "Their fleet has settled into a holding pattern," David reported, pulling up a display of the Threxian formation. "No further aggressive movements in the last 2 hours. It's like they're waiting for something." "Orders from higher up, probably," Marcus said. "That Grand Admiral didn't strike me as someone who makes big decisions alone." Sarah nodded slowly, studying the data. "Priya, has there been any more chatter on the observer channels?" Lieutenant Nair pulled up a series of intercepted transmissions. "Quite a bit, actually. It looks like word of what happened here has already spread to at least a dozen different systems. The Ethar in particular seem very interested. There's a lot of what I'd call excitement in some of these transmissions, almost like relief." "Relief," Marcus repeated, "because we laughed at the scary aliens." "Because we showed that the scary aliens can be laughed at," Sarah corrected gently. "There's a difference, Marcus. For a lot of these species, the Threxian Dominion has been an unstoppable force for centuries. Nobody has ever pushed back against their fear tactics and survived to tell the story. We might be the first." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone considered the weight of that idea. "Admiral," David said slowly, "if that's true, then this isn't just about us anymore. This is being watched by half the quadrant." "I know," Sarah said. "Which means whatever happens next, we need to handle it carefully. Laughing at a bad speech is one thing. Whatever comes next, they're not going to let us laugh our way through it easily." As if on cue, a soft chime sounded from Lieutenant Nair's console. She checked it quickly, her eyebrows rising. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the Voice of Extinction. Different frequency this time, formal diplomatic channel." Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Put it through to the main bridge. Let's hear what they have to say." Back on the bridge, the main screen flickered to life, showing Grand Admiral Kethrani once more, though his posture and expression were noticeably different from before. Gone was the dramatic lighting and slow, booming speech. He stood simply, formally, his hands clasped behind his back. "Admiral Chen," he said, his voice measured and controlled, "I have consulted with Dominion leadership. We wish to propose a resolution to this confrontation." "I'm listening, Grand Admiral," Sarah said. "A formal challenge," Kethrani said. "Single ship combat, commander against commander, witnessed openly by all observing parties in this system. If your ship defeats mine, the Dominion fleet will withdraw from this system entirely, and this territory dispute will be considered settled in humanity's favor." Sarah kept her expression carefully neutral. "And if we lose, then your fleet will withdraw," Kethrani said, "and this system will be recognized as Threxian territory, with no further resistance from your government." Marcus leaned close to Sarah, whispering low, "This is a trap, Sarah. His flagship alone probably outguns our entire fleet combined. This isn't a fair fight." Sarah gave a small nod to show she had heard him, but kept her focus on the screen. "Why a duel, Grand Admiral? Why not simply attack with your full fleet, if you believe your ship can defeat mine?" Kethrani's jaw tightened slightly. The Dominion values honor in combat. A direct challenge allows for a resolution without unnecessary loss of life on either side. Sarah almost smiled at that. It was, she suspected, only part of the truth. The real reason, she guessed, had far more to do with restoring the Dominion's damaged reputation than with any genuine concern for honor or unnecessary casualties. A public duel, witnessed by every watching species, offered the Threxians a chance to prove their strength directly, without the messy complication of humans laughing through another dramatic speech. "I need a moment to consult with my crew," Sarah said. "You have 10 minutes, Kethrani replied, and the transmission cut off. Sarah turned to face Marcus, David, and the rest of the bridge crew, all of whom were watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Thoughts?" she asked. "It's risky," David said immediately. "Their flagship's weapons are almost certainly superior to ours. If this comes down to a straight firepower contest, we lose." "Agreed," Marcus said. "But refusing sends its own message too. After everything that's happened today, if we back down from a direct challenge, every species watching is going to wonder if our earlier confidence was just an act." Sarah nodded slowly, turning the problem over in her mind. She thought about the recordings spreading across the quadrant, about the Ethar and the coalition of free worlds, and dozens of other species watching this exact moment unfold, waiting to see what humanity would do next. She thought, too, about something her old academy instructor had told her years ago, a lesson that had stuck with her through every difficult command decision since. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the biggest weapons. It is the one who has already decided how the fight is going to go before it even starts. "David," Sarah said slowly, "pull up everything we have on the Voice of Extinction's design specifications. Every scrap of intelligence we've gathered on Threxian shipbuilding." "Already have it up, Admiral," David said, turning his screen toward her. Sarah studied the data carefully, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something interesting buried in the technical specifications. "Marcus," she said, "look at this. Their primary weapon systems, the ones designed for maximum destructive power, they take almost 90 seconds to charge between shots. That's an enormous cooldown period for a flagship." Marcus leaned over to look, frowning thoughtfully. "That tracks with what we saw earlier. They fired once, and then spent a good while just talking instead of firing again."
"Because they couldn't," Sarah said, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "Their weapon is powerful, terrifyingly powerful, but it's slow."
"It's built for maximum impact against enemies who are already frozen with fear, not for a fast-moving, agile fight against an opponent who knows exactly how it works." David's eyes widened slightly as he understood where she was going. "You think we can outmaneuver them?" "I think," Sarah said, "that the Threxian Dominion has spent 4,000 years building weapons designed to work against enemies who are too scared to fight back properly. I don't think they've had to actually outfly or outthink anyone in a very long time. Fear did most of the work for them." She turned back to the main screen, straightening her uniform, her expression calm and focused. "Priya," she said, "open a channel back to the Voice of Extinction. Tell Grand Admiral Kethrani we accept his challenge." A ripple of tension passed across the bridge, but nobody argued. Sarah's confidence, calm and steady, seemed to settle the room almost immediately. "Aye, Admiral," Lieutenant Nair said, already working the console. As the channel opened, Sarah allowed herself one small, private thought before the transmission connected. Somewhere out there, watching this exact moment, were dozens of species who had lived for generations under the shadow of the Threxian Dominion's fear. Species who had surrendered planets, given up freedoms, and bent their entire cultures around the belief that resistance was pointless. If humanity was about to prove that belief wrong, Sarah intended to prove it properly. The screen flickered back to life, showing Grand Admiral Kathrani's stony gray face, waiting expectantly. "Grand Admiral," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "we accept your challenge. UES resolute against the voice of extinction. Let's see what your empire is really made of." Kathrani's red eyes glinted with something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps something closer to relief. "Very well, Admiral Chen," he said. "Prepare your ship. This duel will decide far more than the fate of a single border system." The transmission ended, and across the dark space of the Kepler border, two ships began preparing for a battle that half the galaxy would soon be watching. The duel was set to begin in 1 hour, and in that hour, the Kepler border system became one of the most watched places in the entire quadrant. More observer ships arrived quietly at the system's edge, drawn by word of the coming battle. A Voss collective scout vessel slipped in from the far side of the system. A pair of Grelin hive drones, small and fast, took up position near the outer asteroid belt. Even a heavily disguised Threxian rival faction ship arrived, eager to see whether their own Dominion's proud Grand Admiral would stumble. All of them watched, and all of them recorded, knowing that whatever happened in the next hour would be remembered for generations. Aboard the Resolute, Sarah stood in the center of her bridge, going over the final preparations with her senior officers gathered close around her. "Their main weapon takes 90 seconds to recharge after each shot," Sarah said, tapping the display in front of her. "That means after their opening shot, we have a window, a narrow one, but a real one. David, I need our maneuvering thrusters at maximum responsiveness. We are not going to sit still and trade blows with a ship built to overpower enemies who don't move." "Understood, Admiral," David said. "Marcus, I want every non-essential system rerouted to support engine output and shield regeneration during the fight. We're not trying to outpunch them. We're trying to outlast and outmaneuver them until we can find an opening." "And if there isn't an opening?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah met his eyes steadily. "Then we make one." Across the bridge, the crew worked with quiet, focused determination. There was no laughter now, no joking. Everyone understood the seriousness of what was about to happen. But underneath that seriousness, Sarah could still feel something different in the air, compared to when the Threxian fleet had first arrived. The fear that had lingered at the edges of everyone's minds that morning had been replaced by something steadier, not recklessness but confidence, earned honestly through the strange events of the day. "Admiral," Lieutenant Nair said, "transmission from the voice of extinction. They're ready to begin." Sarah took a slow breath, straightening her shoulders. "Take us to the designated coordinates. Let's finish this." The two ships met in the open space between the human and Threxian fleets, each surrounded by a wide, empty ring left clear by both sides for the duel. Dozens of observer ships hung at a careful distance, watching from every angle. On the main screen, Grand Admiral Kathrani appeared one final time, standing tall and formal aboard his own bridge. "Admiral Chen," he said, "are you prepared?" "Ready when you are, Grand Admiral," Sarah replied. "Then let us begin," Kathrani said, "and let the outcome speak for itself." The transmission ended, and for a brief moment, both ships hung motionless in the dark, facing each other across several thousand kilometers of empty space. Then, without warning, the voice of extinction's primary cannon began to charge, a bright white glow building rapidly along its massive hull. "They're firing first," David called out. "Charging fast, faster than before. I think they upgraded the systems after the first shot." "Evasive pattern now," Sarah ordered. The Resolute banked hard, engines flaring as it curved sharply away from its previous position. A heartbeat later, the primary cannon fired, a blinding beam of white energy tearing through the space where the Resolute had been only seconds before, missing by a comfortable margin. "Clean miss," David confirmed. Cannon is recharging. 90-second window starts now. Bring us in close, Sarah ordered. David, target their secondary weapon batteries. Marcus, I want everything we've got on those thrusters. The Resolute surged forward, weaving in a tight, unpredictable pattern as it closed the distance toward the massive Threxian flagship. Smaller weapons fire erupted from the Voice of Extinction's secondary batteries, dozens of energy blasts filling the space between the two ships. But the Resolute's rapid shifting movements made it a difficult target, each shot missing by narrow but sufficient margins. Shields at 94%, David reported. We're staying ahead of their fire. Firing solution locked on their secondary batteries, called out the weapons officer. Fire, Sarah ordered. The Resolute's own weapons, smaller than the Threxian flagships but far more precise and quick to fire, lanced out across the gap between the two ships, striking a cluster of secondary weapon emplacements along the Voice of Extinction's hull. Small explosions bloomed silently across the enemy ship's dark surface. Aboard the Voice of Extinction, alarms blared across the command deck as Sub-Commander Threll checked his damage reports. Grand Admiral, secondary batteries 3 and 4 are offline. The humans are targeting our weapon systems directly, not our hull. Kathrani's claws dug into his command throne. They are being precise, deliberate. Should we bring the primary cannon around for another shot? Threll asked. It is still recharging, Kathrani snapped. Increase power to remaining weapon batteries. Do not let that ship stay close to us. The battle continued, the massive Threxian flagship struggling to bring its heavier weapons to bear against the smaller, faster human ship, which continued to weave and dodge with a precision that seemed to grow more confident with every passing minute. Sarah watched the tactical display closely, timing each maneuver carefully, always keeping the Resolute just out of reach of the enemy's most dangerous weapons while continuing to chip away at their secondary systems. Cannon recharge at 70%, David called out. 30 seconds until they can fire again. Bring us around to their blind spot, aft ventral side, Sarah ordered. If they fire that cannon again, I want us somewhere it physically cannot reach. The Resolute dove sharply, curving beneath the massive Threxian flagship, sliding into a narrow blind spot created by the ship's own enormous hull. Seconds later, the primary cannon fired again, this time unable to find a clear line of sight to its target, the beam tearing harmlessly into empty space, far from the Resolute's new position. On the Threxian command deck, Kathrani watched his tactical display with growing alarm as the human ship continued to evade every attack, striking precisely at weak points in his own ship's defenses with unsettling accuracy. How, Kathrani said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, is a ship a fraction of our size avoiding every attack we throw at it? Grand Admiral, Threll said carefully, our weapons were designed primarily for overwhelming force against enemies, too frightened to maneuver effectively. We have not fought a genuinely agile, unafraid opponent I do not believe we have ever fought an opponent quite like this. Kathrani's red eyes flashed with something between fury and dawning realization. 4,000 years of conquest had been built on fear breaking an enemy's will before the fighting truly began. But this enemy had never been afraid. Not really. Not in the way the right of judgment was designed to exploit. And without that fear working in their favor, the Dominion's weapons, powerful as they were, suddenly seemed less suited to this kind of fight than Kathrani had ever imagined possible. The battle continued for nearly 20 minutes, the Resolute weaving and striking with careful precision, while the Voice of Extinction struggled to bring its heavier weapons to bear against an opponent who refused to stay still long enough to be caught. Slowly, steadily, the human ship's weapons fire began to take its toll, knocking out weapon systems, damaging engines, chipping away at the Threxian flagship's considerable but increasingly strained defenses. Finally, with a final, precisely aimed strike from the Resolute's weapons, the Voice of Extinction's primary cannon housing took a direct hit, sending a shower of sparks and debris across its massive hull. The great weapon, the one that had fired so proudly and dramatically at the start of the encounter, fell silent, its power systems damaged beyond immediate repair. On the Threxian command deck, alarms blared across every console. Sub-Commander Threll looked up from his damaged systems report, his expression grim. Grand Admiral, he said quietly, primary weapon is offline. Secondary batteries at 40% capacity. Shields at 31% and falling. Kethrani sat very still in his command throne, staring at the tactical display showing the small, agile human ship still moving confidently around his crippled flagship, weapons ready for another strike if needed. For a long moment the command deck was silent, every officer waiting to see what their Grand Admiral would decide. Then, slowly, Kethrani rose from his throne. "Open a channel to the human flagship," he said quietly. On the bridge of the Resolute, Sarah watched the tactical display carefully as the Voice of Extinction's weapon systems fell silent one by one. The crew around her remained tense, focused, ready for whatever might come next. "Incoming transmission from the Voice of Extinction," Lieutenant Nair said. "Put it through," Sarah said. The screen flickered to life, showing Grand Admiral Kethrani standing before her, his proud posture noticeably diminished, though he still held himself with a kind of quiet dignity. "Admiral Chen," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "My ship's primary weapon systems are disabled. My shields are failing. I concede this duel." Sarah nodded slowly, keeping her expression calm and respectful. "Thank you, Grand Admiral. I appreciate you honoring the terms of the challenge." "As agreed," Kethrani continued, "the Dominion fleet will withdraw from this system. This territory will be recognized as neutral, unclaimed by the Dominion, going forward." There was a pause, and Sarah could see something shift in Kethrani's expression, something that looked almost like genuine curiosity beneath the exhaustion of defeat. "Admiral Chen," he said slowly, "may I ask you something, honestly, without further mockery?" "Of course, Grand Admiral," Sarah said. "How did your people know our weapons would be so poorly suited against an opponent who did not fear us?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't think we knew for certain, Grand Admiral, but we suspected. Your Dominion built an empire on fear. That's a powerful tool, I won't deny that, but a tool built entirely around exploiting fear only works as well as the fear itself. When that fear doesn't take hold, everything built around it, your weapons, your tactics, even your ships, they're left exposed in ways you never had to plan for before." Kethrani was quiet for a long moment, processing this. 4,000 years, he said softly, and we never once considered what might happen if the fear simply failed to work. "Maybe it's time to consider it now," Sarah said, not unkindly. Kethrani inclined his head slightly, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Perhaps it is, Admiral, perhaps it is." The transmission ended, and slowly, silently, the Threxian fleet began to withdraw from the Kepler border system, ship by ship disappearing into the dark distance, leaving human space undisturbed for the first time since their arrival. News of what had happened at the Kepler border spread across the galaxy faster than any fleet could travel. Within days, the recordings had reached every corner of Threxian-influenced space, carried eagerly by species who had lived for generations under the shadow of Dominion fear. The story spread from world to world, growing with each retelling, but the core of it remained the same everywhere it was told. A young species, barely a few centuries into space travel, had faced down one of the oldest and most feared empires in the galaxy, and instead of trembling in fear, they had laughed. And when the laughter had not been enough to end the confrontation, they had fought smart, using their enemy's own overconfidence against them, and won. For the Ithar kingdoms, the recording sparked the first serious conversations in generations about whether their old surrender to the Dominion might someday be reversed. For the coalition of free worlds, it prompted urgent discussions about forming closer ties with this strange new species called humanity, one that seemed to possess a kind of resilience nobody had expected. For dozens of smaller species scattered across contested territory, it offered something that had been rare for a very long time: hope. Aboard the UES Resolute, Admiral Sarah Chen stood once more at the observation window, watching the stars stretch out calm and endless before her, much as they had at the very beginning of this long, strange day. Marcus walked up beside her, still smiling faintly from the events of the last few hours. "You know," he said, "when this started, I genuinely thought we might not make it through the day." "So did I," Sarah admitted. "But I had a feeling, once that speech started, once I saw how theatrical it all was, that maybe we had something they didn't expect. A sense of humor, Marcus said. A sense of familiarity, Sarah corrected gently. We've told ourselves stories about villains like that for thousands of years. Turns out, that made us harder to scare than they ever imagined. Marcus nodded slowly, looking out at the same endless stars. You think this is over? The Dominion, I mean. You think they'll really stay away? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think, she said, that today, for the first time in 4,000 years, a lot of species out there learned that the Threxian Dominion can be beaten, not just in battle, but in the fear that made battle unnecessary in the first place. I don't think that kind of thing goes back into the box once it's out. She turned away from the window, looking back at her bridge crew, still working steadily at their stations, calm and confident in a way they had not been that morning. Whatever comes next, Sarah said quietly, I think humanity just changed something out here, something bigger than just us. Outside, the stars continued their slow, silent turning, indifferent as always to the affairs of empires and fleets. But somewhere out among them, word continued to spread, carried from world to world, of the day a young species faced down an ancient empire's greatest weapon, and instead of freezing in fear, had simply burst into laughter. And across the galaxy, in places the Threxian Dominion had ruled through fear for centuries, that laughter was only just beginning to spread.